Okay, so we're going to start off with the overview of the disbursement request process. So each jurisdiction approved for participation in the SSBCI capital program will receive its allocation of main capital funds, allocations for SETI-owned businesses, and allocations for very small businesses in 3 disbursements versus 33%, 33%, and then 34%. Each jurisdiction receives their first tranche after the approval of the jurisdiction's application. Jurisdictions must certify to Treasury that they have expended, obligated, or transferred, commonly referred to as EOT, 80% or more of their prior disbursement of allocated funds to or for the account of one or more approved programs that have delivered loans or investments to eligible businesses to receive their second tranche. And to receive their third tranche, the jurisdiction must have EOT'd 100% of the first tranche and 80% or more of their second tranche. In addition, per Section 2.4 of the allocation agreement, PJs must provide to Treasury a certification in the form of Annex A to the allocation agreement, certificate required as a condition to disbursement, signed by the authorized official, as well as any supporting documentation requested by Treasury. Treasury created an optional disbursement request template that PJs should use when requesting their subsequent disbursement, and PJs can access the template the same way as the quarterly and annual report templates in the portal. The template intends to capture jurisdiction-specific and transaction information necessary for Treasury to review the jurisdiction's disbursement request for compliance with SSBCI program requirements. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so once the jurisdiction has submitted a complete disbursement request package, which includes 1, the completed disbursement request template, 2, the signed Annex A, and 3, supporting documents for transactions that compliance selected for review. Compliance will then perform a review of those transactions according to SSBCI program requirements. Upon completing the review of the disbursement request package, SSBCI will discuss questions, issues, or concerns with the jurisdiction via email and meetings. The disbursement request process will involve regular communication between compliance and jurisdictions. So PJ should ensure they have appropriate staff and personnel available to address any follow-up questions and provide additional documents if requested. Of course, our goal is to expedite this process and ensure that you receive your funds in a timely manner. Okay, next slide. So first things first, when coming to the disbursement request process, is we're going to be looking at the eligibility of your transactions. So I won't go through the definition of eligible business purpose. You guys should all be and probably are very familiar with the definition. But so far in the disbursement request that we have processed, we have seen several business purposes. We've seen constructing new buildings, converting, renovating, expanding existing buildings, refinancing outstanding debt, purchasing existing buildings, and working capital. So there's many business purposes that are eligible, and to find the full list of them, you can refer to the reporting guidance. One thing we want to make sure you're aware of is to make sure that these transactions, while the purpose is eligible, they don't include goodwill, because that will make the transaction ineligible. Okay, and another general reminder is that your application is part of your allocation agreement, and that your application will be considered when we're reviewing the transactions on your disbursement request form. Okay, next slide, Grace. Right, so another big one is making sure that you have categorized the transactions correctly between expended, obligated, and transferred. So for transactions to be considered expended, SSBCI funds must be dispersed to a specific borrower or lender as part of a set-aside to cover a loan guarantee, collateral deposit, or purchase participation for a specific transaction that has closed. For VC equity transactions, SSBCI funds must be directly invested in a specific business. For example, in a loan guarantee transaction, the amount set aside to cover the guarantee, typically held in a reserve account, can be reported as expended when the loan closes. Similarly, in a collateral support transaction, the set-aside amount, typically held in a depository bank or trustee bank, can be reported as expended when the loan closes. For transactions to be considered obligated, SSBCI funds must be committed, pledged, or promised in writing to a lender or borrower as part of a specific loan participation to a specific borrower, but the loan has not contractually closed. Likewise, for an LGP or collateral support transaction, SSBCI funds must be made as a commitment to cover guarantees and collateral deposits but the loan has not contractually closed. For direct investments to be considered obligated, there should be a signed investment agreement and the funds have not been received by the business. For fund investment programs, funds must be committed, pledged, or promised in writing as part of a VC fund agreement, and the obligation is at the fund level. The main thing to note for transferred is that there should be a documented need to fund a loan or investment or to pay for allowable expenses. All right, next slide. Okay, another big one is identifying the correct provider on your disbursement request form. So for each transaction, jurisdictions should be sure to input the correct provider. Many of the provider definitions are straightforward and can be found here on the slide and in the reporting guidance, but I want to highlight a few. First, I want to touch on the companion loan transaction provider. So the provider for companion loans is the lender whose loan is the source of private capital at risk for the transaction. And I also want to touch on hybrid programs. So they are treated as the equity programs and should be reported on the equity tab. The provider for hybrid transactions is based on the equity program. So if your program is a direct hybrid program, the provider would follow the definition found here for direct investment programs. And if your program is a funds hybrid program, the provider would follow the definition for fund investment programs found on this slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, this one may seem a little straightforward, but we do want to clarify here. For loan transactions, when you're inputting the loan or investment amount, it should be the loan, the total loan amount should be the lender contribution plus SSBCI allocated funds. So those are the only two that should be input under loan or investment amount. And for VC transactions, for both direct investment programs and fund investment programs, the total investment amount should be the private capital investment and the SSBCI allocated funds. Okay, and then also as a little note, SSBCI allocated funds is the SSBCI funds only. That's also going to be a field on the disbursement request form. Okay, next slide. All right, also as a tab on the disbursement request form is administrative costs. So when inputting this administrative costs, you should be sure to ensure that they are allowable, reasonable, and allocable based on 2 CFR, Part 200, Subpart E. So we're going to be verifying that the expenses are allowable, reasonable, and allocable based on 2 CFR. So just ensure that that documentation is adequately maintained so that we can verify that these transactions are eligible. Okay, next slide. All right, so this one is sort of touching on what we talked about recently if you attended the quarterly report training, but it's very important for the disbursement request form. So as you know, administrative expenses can be paid for using program income as an offset, but I want to make sure you know that if you offset administrative expenses using program income, that those transactions that were offset using program income cannot be reported on the disbursement request form and cannot be counted towards your EOT. So we just wanted to highlight that and make sure that you guys are aware of that. And of course, in order to offset with program income, you have to have a sufficient amount of program income. Okay, next slide. All right, another tab is the 171. So for each sampled provider charging for services to portfolio companies, participating jurisdictions should maintain proper documentation per the national compliance standards. Jurisdictions should consider adopting best practices to monitor venture capital fund activities in line with industry standards, such as reviewing the venture capital fund's documentation of services provided. Okay, so just something to keep in mind for that tab. All right, next slide. Okay, so here we're going to get into how participating jurisdictions should report fund investment program obligated and expended transactions separately on the disbursement request form. So in the example here, the total VC commitment is $7 million and the total SSBCI obligation is $3.5 million to the Alpha Venture Fund LP. From that commitment, 2 transactions have been expended, i.e. SSBCI funds and private capital have been invested directly into a portfolio company. The expended transactions should be reported as a typical transaction would be reported with all the required data elements entered, as you can see down here at the bottom of the disbursement request form. For obligated transactions in a VC fund investment program, you're reporting the data at the VC fund level. The first, investment or investee-specific information may be left blank on obligated transactions on the disbursement request form. When reporting the SSBCI allocated funds on the disbursement request form for this obligation, jurisdictions should reduce 3 items from the total SSBCI commitment. 1, the total investment amount for both expended transactions. 2, the total admin expenses. And 3, the total 171 fund services cost to portfolio companies. When reporting the investment transaction amount on the disbursement request form for this obligation, the total VC fund commitment should be reduced by the amount of the expended transactions, the VC admin fund expenses, as well as the 171 fund services cost to portfolio companies. I know this may sound complicated, but Grace will cover this transaction during her demonstration on the disbursement request form, also during the demonstration of the fund investment disbursement worksheet, and we can answer any questions during this training. All right, next slide, please. Okay, accessing the disbursement request form. A user will have different levels of access based on their assigned role in the portal. Jay Flowers will be going over the different levels of access in his demonstration later, but we want to highlight the different levels here. The account administrator role is the most restrictive role. This user can only view and download the template. The account point of contact or POC role is also able to view and download the template, but this user can also upload a completed report. Lastly, the authorized representative role can view, download the template, upload a completed report, and is the only user who can certify and submit a report. As an example, if an account POC uploaded a completed report, an authorized representative would still need to certify and submit the report for it to be submitted to Treasury. If the user does not have an authorized representative role, an error message will appear, preventing the user from submitting the report. Also, for clarification, for reporting purposes, the authorized representative for reporting is a role in the SSBCI reporting portal. In contrast, a participating jurisdiction's authorized representative in the allocation agreement is an official with authority to sign the allocation agreement on behalf of the PJ. Once the user with an authorized representative role submits the disbursement request template, a link will be immediately sent to the authorized official from the allocation agreement via DocuSign to complete Annex A. And Jay will cover that as well later in this demonstration. All right, that's all for me. I'm going to pass it over to Grace.